Welcome everyone to the sixth talk of our of our fourth series of Graeco-Aegyptiaca lectures, and which are being co-organized by the Department of Greek and Latin at University College London and by the Palladion, which is a community-based organization based in Budapest in Hungary, formed in 2020, which focuses on outreach, education, and research into the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean. And today, I'm very fortunate to be able to introduce a wonderful young scholar, Jaqueline Stock, who's a research fellow and PhD student at the University of Leipzig. She uh, she studied in Heidelberg and Göttingen, and she's working mainly, I guess, on Roman period texts and demotic texts, but she's also already published an edition of a New Kingdom text called Body and Head. And today she's going to give us some chapters, I suppose, from her ongoing PhD project, which is very exciting. Uh, insights into entitled Insights into Scribal Practices at Egyptian Temple Libraries from the Papyrus Copies of the Book of the Fayum. So, Jaqueline, when you're ready, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you also for the invitation to have the opportunity to do this talk. And yeah, like you mentioned, I chose this topic for today's lecture because I have been working on this ancient Egyptian text composition known as the Book of the Fayum as part of my doctoral research at the University of Leipzig. Oh, no, so. So the working title of my dissertation is New Edition and Analysis of the Book of the Fayum. And today I would like to share with you some selected excerpts as well as first ideas and observations from my research so far. This is therefore also work in progress and not a finished analysis of the whole topic. My focus will be particularly on how the analysis of the archaeological context and variation among the textual witnesses can help us better understand the use and also the transmission and production of the Book of the Fayum. To guide you through this topic, I have structured the lecture into four main parts. First, I will briefly introduce what exactly the Book of the Fayum is. Second, we will take a closer look at the Fayum region itself, which forms the geographical and religious background of the text. Third, I will discuss the archaeological context and the surviving copies, where and how they were found. And this is also where we talk a little bit about temple libraries. And finally, we will turn to the scribal practices and philological work evident in the hieratic and the hieratic-demotic manuscripts. As you can see, I have included the hieratic copies because they are also essential for understanding the hieratic-demotic versions. Let's start. What exactly is the Book of the Fayum? A question I always am confronted with my whole PhD journey so far. So before examining this Fayum region and its scribal habits, it is essential to introduce our protagonist, the Book of the Fayum. A proper introduction, at least I know it like this, usually begins with the name of the protagonist. Yet in this case, the designation, you could say, is anything but straightforward. The Book of the Fayum is a really complex ancient Egyptian composition that functions both as a religious and geographical handbook. It offers a mythological tour through the Fayum region, linking specific localities with religious narratives, deities, and cosmological concepts. And because no original title has survived, the Book of the Fayum is just a nickname. Modern scholars employ a variety of these nicknames and other labels. Examples of these can be seen here, but what does an ancient Egyptian composition has to do with books, monographs, or even bestsellers? Yeah, everything and nothing, you could say. Let us first start with the term book, which is by far the most common label. The title Book of the Fayum was introduced by Horst Beinlich in his first edition of the composition in 1991. It is, you could say, an established working title assigned to allow for consistent citation, but this kind of naming reflects also, you can perhaps call it, trend in Egyptology of assigning titles to otherwise untitled Egyptian composition, especially from the Roman period. The Book of the Temple, which you can see here, Book of Nut, and Book of Thoth are well-known examples. The original title of the Book of Nut is The Fundamentals of the Course of the Stars, and the Book of Thoth was recently rebranded as Ritual for Entering the Chamber of Darkness. However, as book is a kind of anachronistic term, it is not used as a working title without critique. But as Chana Agraria recently noted, alternative terms for untitled compositions like this, and these alternatives may be manuscript, text, or even papyrus, can be somewhat more misleading, since we associate them with physically mobile texts, as the papyrus copies of these compositions clearly are. Yet, for example, in the case of the Book of the Fayum and the Book of Nut, physical immobile copies also exist, such as the temple one here in Kom-Ombo, which contains part of the Book of the Fayum. The coexistence of such diverse formats should lead us to consider maybe applying the term book more loosely and therefore to understand book as an idea without a fixed physical form. Accordingly, the title Book of the Fayum will be used throughout this presentation to refer to this composition. Since we now started talking about the physical form of our text, perhaps we should discuss the description that stands out from the rest. The definition that the Book of the Fayum was one of the bestsellers of its time. This may sound a little strange at first, but it describes an important aspect that is central to the work on the composition. The term does not imply commercial profit, but rather reflects the high amount of different text copies that are already briefly mentioned in the introduction. The most prominent are the surviving hieroglyphic-illustrated versions, which you can see here. This is a copy of the so-called papyrus Bullock Amherst Hood. These copies are also the focus of Horst Beinlich text editions. On the picture, we have this papyrus Hood. Additional parts of it can be found in Cairo and New York. The copy stands out due to its length, its state of preservation, and the numerous illustrations. In addition to this, there are several fragments of 2 or 3 other hieroglyphic illustrated copies. They are all quite similar to each other as a direct comparison of the mentioned papyrus Bullock Amherst with an additional fragment of a papyrus in Vienna shells. In particular, the illustrations of these manuscripts do not really differ from each other. So we have here the same part, the same section. We have here the crocodile, which can be seen here also. And I can see it because of this line. But now we also have the goddesses here, which can also be seen here. Quite a standard among the hieroglyphic copies is the only monumental version of the text found at an Egyptian temple. In this case, the Book of the Fayum was not only written without illustrations, but they are also apart from the visible boundary lines. You can see here, for example, no additional features that structure the text. This is an important point because the wall reproduces several parallel passages from the Book of the Fayum, but in a different order than we find them in the papyri. So the majority of the first half, which you can see here, is occupied by the Book of the Fayum. Interestingly, this is not immediately followed by another quotation from the composition, but by a line that is not assigned to the Book of the Fayum at all, highlighted here in green. The second half of the roll follows also different, you could say, different compositional guidelines. It arranged 6 distinct passages of varying lengths from the Book of the Fayum into a coherent sequence. The Kom-Ombo temple, to which this passage belongs, is dedicated to the god Sobek and Hieroeris and was designed as a double temple with 2 parallel sanctuaries and cult axes, as shown here in the plan. The excerpts from the Book of Fayum are located on a wall that, unsurprisingly, forms part of the southern half of the temple dedicated to Sobek. However, the largest group among the Book of the Fayum manuscripts is not the hieroglyphic material, but the hieratic sources, which were also written entirely without the illustrations found in the hieroglyphic-illustrated papyri. The actual amount of copies is still a matter of debate, or as a favorite detective once said, I have never found 2 handwriting experts who agree on any point whatsoever. This is also true for the hieratic copies, especially given their fragmentary conditions. Scholarly estimates range from 13 to 22 manuscripts. They clearly outnumber the hieroglyphic copies, although a detailed analysis of their paleographic features, which will aid in assigning the fragments to specific manuscripts, is lacking. It will therefore be part of my dissertation. However, this is not the focus of today's presentation. Regarding the hieratic copies, it should be also noted that the column of the hieratic papyrus shown in this picture here is part of the so-called papyrus body A, the best preserved and therefore the most comprehensive copy of the Book of the Fayum known to date. The last group to be mentioned are the hieratic-demotic copies of the composition. The number is also debatable and ranges from 3 to 6 copies. The special feature, you could say, is that they contain a hieratic version of the composition on the one hand and have a demotic Inner Egyptian translation and commentary on the other. They therefore testify the intensive engagement with the composition and also underline its importance, since only a few Egyptian compositions are known to have a translation and a commentary like this. But overall, you could say the high number of these surviving copies that I presented to you, some of which come also from the same place, as we will discuss later, is also proof of the importance of the Book of the Fayum. But let's now talk also about the most common term that is associated with the Book of the Fayum that may help us also to gain more information about the general content of the composition. It is the term monograph. It was first introduced by Adolphe Godbert in the 1970s and classifies works that systematically compile the religious knowledge of a specific district. The Book of the Fayum exemplifies this genre. It arranges Fayum-related religious traditions above all concerning those of the crocodile god Sobek in a geographical framework. Additionally, the first 3 sections of the Fayum book, in particular, are quite literally a map. As Egyptologist Sander Lippert has shown, they reflect the composition's aim to represent Fayum as the microcosm of Egypt, by depicting various geographical features of the Fayum as Egypt's nomes, the Nile, and even the source of the Nile. But what does that mean? What is the Fayum regions? I think as enthusiasts of the Greco-Roman period in Egypt, I assume most of us are already somewhat familiar with this area. The multicultural landscape is of central importance for classical philologists, archaeologists, and Egyptologists alike. But let's now take a closer look at its natural features to better understand what the Book of the Fayum is actually talking about. First, you could say the hard facts. The Fayum is located west of the Nile, about 19 kilometers southwest of modern Cairo. Geographically, it lies in a western, or you could also say Libyan desert of Egypt. The region sits in a geological depression with its lowest point in the north reaching 53 meters below sea level. One of the most important natural features of the region is its water supply, which has always defined life in the Fayum and differs slightly from that of the Delta and Nile Valley. Water is provided by the Bahr Yusuf, a branch of the Nile that splits off near Asyut and enters the Fayum as its eastern gateway, Al-Lahun. as you can see also here. It branches into several smaller channels. It branches into several smaller channels that make up the Fayum's artificial canal network. This network ensures that water is distributed among the villages. Agricultural wastewater is then collected in the lake visible in the north of the Fayum. In antiquity, this lake served also as the region's only drainage sump. The water situation has been quite fitting described by Brandon Hawke as predictably unpredictable. This means that the region's water supply depends directly on the level of the annual Nile flood. Too little water leads to drought, as it cannot reach the cultivated areas of the settlements. Too much water, however, results in flooding and the destruction of crops. As several scholars has already pointed out, maintaining this water flow was a communal task. Administrative papyri testify, for example, that the inhabitants were responsible for the maintenance of the canals. An important task because, in contrast to the delta and the Nile Valley, where settlements on the floodplain had already equal access to water, in the Fayum water was delivered in stages via this canal system. This gave upstream settlements a distinctive advantage. They could reduce the water supply of downstream settlements by blocking the canal or drawing excessive amounts of water. This significance of the Nile flood is also reflected in the Book of the Fayum. Numerous passages deal with its importance. For example, this is the beginning of a section that describes the cause of the flood. It comes from the hieratic papyrus body A. In this passage, the Nile pufferfish, which you can also see here, traveled south to fetch the Nile and then returns with the rising floodwaters. The referent for the feminine suffix s here is the Fayum region, and especially the goddess Mehet-Beret, which can also be translated as the Great Flood. Our Nile pufferfish is mentioned here because he can be interpreted as the bringer of the flood, because the flood favored the increased occurrence of this fish. I find this passage quite interesting because already at this point we can see how closely natural phenomena were intertwined with mythology. Everyday life in the Fayum was not just a backdrop for religious ideas, it helped shape them. Many studies on ancient religion describe how the divine was seen in mountains, trees, rivers, and other natural landmarks, and even in human creations. The Book of the Fayum brings this idea to life, in a particular way. It shows how observations of the natural world were transformed into the sacred narrative. A striking example of this close connection is also the main deity in the Fayum, the crocodile god Sobek, who plays an important part in the composition. A religious connection that can also be traced back to the natural environment of the Fayum. As Holger Kockemann has already shown, that the crocodile god was primarily worshipped in swampy and watery regions. In other words, in places where people were in direct contact with crocodiles. The Fayum also plays a special role here, as human intervention in nature through the construction of the already mentioned canals probably also led to conflicts with crocodiles, whose habitat was massively altered as a result. We encounter the crocodile god and his various forms on several occasions in the Book of Fayum. So you can see here in these images. For example, the crocodile deity appears on 2 barks, or here in the so-called crocodile litany, where we can see different forms of the crocodile god Sobek with their respective offerings. But let us get back to the Fayum regions. The agricultural productivity and value of the region depend heavily on the water inflow, both in the Middle Kingdom and during the Ptolemaic period. Significant efforts were made to maintain the water balance, such as building dams and artificial canals to make the land arable and suitable for settlement. From the Ptolemaic period onward, these reclamation projects led to marked increase in settlements. Some of these settlements had pharaonic predecessors, but nearly a dozen were newly founded. In the area of Soknopaiou Nesos, for example, no traces of pre-Ptolemaic settlement have been found. The newly founded settlements led also possibly to the creation of new forms of the crocodile god Sobek, which can be seen through the names of Sobek, which were combined with the names of these new settlements. And also the Fayum is the oldest documented cult area of Sobek and is considered the god's most important regions at all times. A significant increase in sanctuaries for the god can also be placed in the Ptolemaic Roman period. These intensive changes in the early Ptolemaic period have also led some scholars to suggest that the Book of the Fayum was specifically created as a religious foundation for the state-driven project of reclaiming the Fayum during the Ptolemaic era. The main editor of the text so far, Horst Beinlich, proposes that the composition itself was created in the Hellenistic period and transmitted into the Roman period. Dating of the Book of the Fayum's transmission, however, to the Roman period is mainly based on two dated witnesses: the temple wall in Kom-Ombo and the hieratic papyrus Botti-A. The Kom-Ombo text features a cartouche that contains the relatively ambiguous title Autocrator, but nearby we can clearly read the names Tiberius, and this allows us to date at least this text between 14 and 37 CE. Papyrus Botti-A, however, gives a colophon date to September 5th, 135 CE in Hadrian's reign. The other papyrological sources are dated to the Roman period on paleographic grounds. Papyrus Botti-A and other texts with a colophon operate as anchor for these texts without an existing date specification. However, these dates only show when certain copies were produced, not when the text itself was created. The origins of the compositions likely lies much earlier. The fact that the Kom-Ombo 172, which you can see here, is currently the earliest securely dated copy may also well be just coincidence. After all, if we know one thing about the survival of ancient Egyptian texts, is that we are almost certainly only seeing the literal tip of the iceberg. So if we want to understand the creation of the text itself, we hence have to look beyond these individual copies and turn to other factors like the content of the composition. An idea already suggested by scholars like Philippe Deschamps and Ingrid Blom-Böer is that the composition is based on traditions and informations that did not originate in the 1st century BCE, but much earlier. This can already be seen, for example, in the illustrations of the Book of the Fayum. Take this depiction. I really like this depiction. It looks so sweet. Take this depiction of a hippo with a crocodile on its back, which can be interpreted as a Northern Star constellation. Such imagery already appears in the tomb of Sennemut from the 18th dynasty. Another important aspect to consider is the language of the text. The composition of the Book of the Fayum clearly reflects the influence of different stages of Egyptian language. For those less familiar with ancient Egyptian language, let me briefly explain. We generally distinguish between Old Egyptian, Middle Egyptian, Late Egyptian, Demotic, and Coptic. Owing to structural similarities, Old and Middle Egyptians are often grouped together as Earlier Egyptian, while Late Egyptian, Demotic, and Coptic are categorized as Later Egyptian. Interestingly, within the Book of the Fayum, we find passages that display characteristics of both Earlier and Later Egyptians, especially when examining the syntax, notably the use of verbal forms and morphological features. When we look more closely, it becomes clear that many sections are heavily influenced by earlier Egyptian. Just to say that, numerous examples could be cited to illustrate these features. However, since the topic could easily fill an entire presentation on its own, I will limit myself to just this one brief example. And this is the line from Papyrus 48, describes her nude in her role as sky goddess bends over Ra. Here we can observe multiple suffix pronouns indicating possession, such as mute f, his mother, and awid, your pairs of arms, as well as the use of cleft sentence constructed as in earlier Egyptian. However, not far from this passage, we can see a completely different picture, which presents us with rather later Egyptian forms of the text. Here we observe the use of the definite article and the use of compound prepositions such as enshai and ahon-er. The dating of this passage had always sparked a lively debate within Egyptological scholarship, even before I began working on it myself. A major impetus for this discussion came from Joachim Krapp, who proposed that the presence of such compound prepositions could indicate early demotic influence. But it's not just about the prepositions here. The consistent appearance of a definite article, which remember was missing from the earlier sections, clearly shows a shift toward late Egyptian. And there's more. Words like imenet and yabet are treated as masculine instead of feminine, which is another strong sign of demotic influence. As many of you know, probably scholars like Joachim Quack and Alexandra von Lieven have also shown that other texts from the Greco-Roman period blend features from different stages of the Egyptian language. In fact, when it comes to methodological manuals like the Book of the Fayum, it seems very likely that they were stitched together from the range of older sources, spanning various periods. With this in mind, it becomes easier to understand why the Kom-Ombo version of the text not only arranges the material differently, but also lacks any illustrations. As Alexander von Lieven has already suggested, maybe what we see here isn't the Book of the Fayum itself. Maybe it's simply pieces of the source material that were later woven together to form the full composition. But this still doesn't fully explain why we find so many different copies in hieroglyphic, hieratic, and demotic versions. To explore this further, we will first take a closer look at the archaeological context, and then we see what clues the papyri themselves offer about their creation and purpose. However, as we know, reconstructing the archaeological context is not always an easy task, especially for Egyptian papyri, as many of them originate from the antiquities market. The papyri of the Book of the Fayum are no exceptions. Their complicated provenance history is reflected in the large number of different collections that today house fragments of the composition. To date, fragments are known from 30 different collections. The path of the papyri into these collections is part of a really complex provenance history. This is mainly because most of the fragments reach Europe or the United States through the antiquities trade, resulting in an extensive network of individuals and their connections. This development is closely tied to the complex excavation history of the main find spot, Tebtunis, a settlement located on the southern edge of the Fayum basin. Scientific exploration of Tebtunis has been carried out repeatedly by different institutions at different times since the late 19th century. This not only resulted in excavation finds being distributed among various institutions, but the growing awareness of the site also led to looting, which occurred both during and between the campaigns of these institutions. In short, the Fayum book papyri have a very fragmented and complex history, shaped by both excavations and the antiquities trade. Nevertheless, a few papyri can be securely attributed to one controlled excavation. These texts came to light on March the 10th in 1931 during excavations by the Italian archaeologist Carlo Anti in the temple district of Tebtunis. He conducted the work on behalf of the Società Italiana per la Ricerca dei Papyri Greci e Latini in Egitto, which was also involved in founding the Vitelli Institute in Florence. As the organization's name suggests, their primary interest lay in Latin and Greek papyri. However, the Tebtunis find consisted mostly of Egyptian material. Among the discoveries was the often mentioned papyrus 40A, which was found loose in two cellars of a house together with numerous other hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek papyri. Due to the large number of different texts, the find was interpreted as a library, and conclusion also reflected in the description you can see here. This comes from a letter by Carlo Anti. The building where the papyri were found was located in the north within the temenos of the Soknopaiou temple, between the dormers and directly against the western enclosure wall. I also marked it red here. When discovered, the papyri covered the entire floor of the basement rooms and were in places and were heavily damaged. To this day, this find remains the only preserved large-scale institutional library from ancient Egypt. Around 400 different manuscripts, mostly from the 2nd century CE, come from this discovery, including several copies of the Book of the Fayum. After their discovery, the papyri were initially placed into various containers and eventually packed into suitcases for transportation. You can see one of these suitcases here, and I think it's also quite visible how damaged some of the fragments there. Interestingly, the descriptions which you can see here, a letter by Anti's assistant, was for a long time the closest thing we had to an actual archaeological report on the find. However, thanks to the work of scholars like Claudio Galazzi, Kim Riehold, and Eliara Caridi, additional documents, including Anti's diary, photographs, and folders with descriptions, now help in the identification of fragments from the library. This archival material is quite complex, and a full explanation would take too much time and is beyond the scope of today's presentation, especially since old photostats also reveal that the Vitelli Institute exchanged fragments with other institutions, such as the pCarlsberg Foundation. For today's topic, it is just important to know that all fragments of the Book of the Fayum with adjoining pieces in the Museo Egizio in Florence or the Vitelli Institute can be attributed to the temple library. Therefore, this deposit included one hieroglyphic copy of the Book of the Fayum, 10 hieratic copies, but as I mentioned, some of these texts are really fragmented, so the attribution is not always easy and is still in progress. And 3 hieratic-demotic copies. But as I told you now, we have at least 19 different textual witnesses of the Book of the Fayum. What about the other fragments? This can be quite challenging to detect, because the other manuscripts consist mostly of fragments. Therefore, we have mostly no details in archival data about them, because papyrus fragments were kind of mass rare in acquisitions, and they're therefore mostly just a side note in lists about acquisitions. For example, this hieratic-demotic fragment from Berlin has adjoining pieces in Vienna and was part of an acquisition by Heinrich Brucksch on behalf of Rudolf Mosse, who gifted it later to the museum in Berlin. It mostly stems from Soknopaiou Nesos, but as the only entry in the inventory list states, the only entry in the inventory list shows us that mostly these kind of fragments are just put together and described as papyrus fragments from Fayum. Thus, even though most likely, we cannot say for certain for many fragments like this, whether they were part of these acquisitions or even not. Therefore, if we want to understand where and why the Book of the Fayum and its many copies were produced, we cannot rely solely on the fragmentary archaeological evidence. We must also turn to the internal clues preserved within the manuscripts themselves. For today's presentation, I will mainly focus on the cursive copies of the text, even though the 3 surviving hieroglyphic manuscripts certainly enrich our understanding of the Book of the Fayum through their illustrations, they offer far less evidence for active reading and study practices. There are practical reasons for this, their very large dimensions, and the way the text is laid out, in some cases requiring the reader to physically rotate the papyrus to read them. If we also take into account their material properties and formal structure, it becomes clear that they served a different, probably more static or prestigious function than the cursive copies. All 3 hieroglyphic manuscripts are rectoscrolls with a broadly similar layout, as can be seen here and as we discussed earlier. When comparing the Vienna manuscript with the opening sections of the Bullock-Amherst Hood copy, we also saw how similar the illustrations are to each other. Therefore, these copies served maybe a different purpose. This observation had already been made by Alexandra von Lieden, who noted that the unillustrated versions, e.g. the cursive copies, were primarily tools for studying the text more efficiently. But let's now take a closer look at these copies and their specific features that reveal traces in their practical handling. Like I said in the beginning, before turning to the hieratic-demotic copies, we first need to focus on the purely hieratic material. As already mentioned, to properly understand the hieratic manuscripts, a look at this material is really essential. From the Tebtunis temporary library alone, we have around 5 different hieratic copies that are quite similar to each other. I highlighted them in red here. I say around 5 because some fragments are so small that the paleographic attribution is rather difficult. By quite similar, I mean that all these manuscripts are inscribed only on the recto and they're written with a thick reed pen. Guidelines were drawn to organize the columns in text and lines. These copies all have a very consistent layout. On average, the lines are about 1 centimeter high and the individual signs about 0.5 centimeter. Additionally, as we know from the colophon of Papyrus Botier, which belongs to this group, the text was copied for the high priest of Tebtunis. So this is therefore a really prestigious copy. This suggests that the other 3 or 4 texts might also have served as carefully produced high-quality versions. These copies also developed their own internal layout to structure the text. Let's have a look at this specific example. Here we see the same passage that describes various locations in the Fayum. In the hieroglyphic copies, the section is dominated by a large illustration of Lake Moeris with the individual locations marked in small boxes showing deities, which you can see here and here and here. In contrast, the hieratic copies follow a different strategy. Here, the opening phrase of each place description, set 10, is consistently replicated in red ink. You can see here or here or here. As Sarah Brown, who is currently writing a PhD on structure and elements in Egyptian text, notes, the replications not only make it easier to locate the beginning of each passage, but they also emphasize the importance. This emphasis, however, could vary. In the so-called crocodile litany, we already saw an example of the hieroglyphic-illustrated versions of this. It is not the beginning of the lines, but the numbers indicating the quantities of the respected offerings that are written in red. Additionally, in Papyrus Botier, which we also saw here and here and here, it becomes clear that these replications were added later. We can see different spacing, for example, for the signs, and sometimes the red signs interfere with the black ones, like here or here or here. Still, the scribe, clearly tried to ensure that each replicated element would fit cleanly within a single line. She also can see here where it interferes with the guiding line. This contrasts with another hieratic copy where the scribe did not manage to achieve this clean division. As you can see here, the replicated and non-replicated signs overlap across two lines. We saw really similar copies, but not every copy emphasized the same things. This recto manuscript, for example, shown here with fragments from Berlin and Florence, also contains parts of the crocodile litany, but here the numbers of the offerings, you can see, for example, here or here, are not replicated and are still in black ink. Interesting about this copy, if you look more closely at the writings of Sobek, especially forms where the crocodile determinative is combined with the hieratic God sign, it seems likely that these signs too were added later. Again, we find places where there's way too much space, like here, or others where the signs interfere with surrounding ones, like here. But as we discussed with really high quality manuscript, there are also other manuscripts like this one from Vienna. This is a reused manuscript. On the front side, the Book of the Fayum was written down. These are these parts. But on the back, we see a demotic account written in a list-like format. This demotic account follows a paleographical style known for manuscript found at Soknopaiou Nesos. But more interesting for our topic today is that between the texts of the Book of the Fayum, I hope you can see that, are a bit of Greek writing on fronts, barely squeezed between the lines of the Book of the Fayum. And just to be clear, these clear gaps between passages of the Book of the Fayum are not part of the, you could say, normal layout of the text. We also have another example from Tebtunis where a scribe initially began copying the Book of the Temple and then continued with the Book of the Fayum. About these and the other manuscripts, John Tate already suggested that the high number of them points to their use in priestly education. This available evidence, what we saw, indicates that they had cursive manuscripts serving two different purposes. First, as study copies for priests working with the composition, and second, as material for scribal training. A piece of evidence for the practice of young priests studying cursive material during their training can also be found in a Greek papyrus from the 2nd century CE. It describes how a young candidate for priesthood had to prove that he knew hieratic and Egyptian writing. Importantly, he did not have his own copy for this purpose. Instead, he used one produced by an experienced scribe from the temple, maybe like Botier. But let us sum up. Due to the material diversity, the cursive manuscript could have served a variety of purposes. We can get valuable clues about their possible use by taking a closer look at their material characteristics. But this possible function as study objects can also be supported by a content-related argument. For example, we find passages introduced by Kijet, a phrase used to mark a variant in reading. These references do not occur in the hieroglyphic versions and are described differently or missing altogether, which can be seen in this example. They appear exclusively in the hieratic base text and at several different points. In most manuscripts, these variant passages are inserted into the base text without any special highlighting. However, there are also variations how this is handled, as we can see here, where they are highlighted red. Altogether, this phrase can be seen as evidence of philological engagement of the Book of the Fayum, as it points to differences between the sources consulted during the copying process. But to find the clearest example of philological work, we have to turn to the hieratic-demotic copies. These copies are clearly influenced by the hieratic versions because on the one hand, we have logically the hieratic base text, but on the other, we find the same variations like the Keyjet forms we saw before in these copies, as illustrated here in this example. In this case, the variants suggest that a sick man should either be wrapped in cloth or buried. What is more interesting for today's lecture than the content itself we saw before is how this passage is handled afterwards. It is not simply translated into demotic and commented on like the rest of the base text. Instead, a commentary immediately following the passage explains the origins of these variants. Here we can see that means another papyrus has said it about it. This gives us a direct indication that these variants were created because a different text was consulted and consequently the text was critically examined when the copies were made. Just a little side note about particular this copy, it was written by the so-called Noon scribe. It is still unclear whether the scribe refers to an individual or simply is a local handwriting. The style itself is characterized by this really neat appearance that you can see here, relative straight lines and sharp, well-defined angles. Occasionally, Noon also leaves small gaps within a line, sometimes corresponding to natural breaks in the text medium. He must have been a really active scribe because we know at least 13 manuscripts that clearly show these characteristics. Interestingly, these texts are not limited to religious compositions like the Book of the Fayum. They also include narrative literature and even a dream book. If Noon was indeed a single scribe, this would be quite remarkable because Andrea Kucharek has shown in a study of Assyrian ritual texts, scribe could sometimes specialize in certain genres. In contrast, Noon seems to have been more of an all-rounder, copying texts from the wide range of genres. Another interesting feature of the Noon's copy here of the Book of the Fayum is that he did not use any guiding lines to structure the text. This is different from the other hieratic-demotic copies from Tebtunis, which consistently use these kind of guidelines. But in addition to the Tebtunis copies, there is also another fragment which we already saw in this presentation. Here, the signs are noticeably smaller. If you see the direct comparison, the signs are noticeably smaller, and there's barely any space between the lines. It's also remarkable because it represents a verso copy of a hieratic-demotic version of the Fayum. However, the main difference of these two copies lies only in material and layout. The translations and commentaries still begin exactly at the same passages. This is notable because not every sentence was commented on, only selected parts of the text received attention. And even though the manuscripts look very different, we can observe some practical similarities. For example, in this passage, you can see that switching between scripts was not always smooth. Noon occasionally used a demotic determinative within the hieratic text. Interestingly, this occurs in a selection already influenced by later forms of Egyptian. We see the same phenomenon in the Vienna pBerlin manuscript. Here you can see one line of hieratic base text and one line of demotic translation and one line of demotic commentary. You can even watch how the scribe gradually transitions into demotic script, sometimes still using hieratic signs for the demotic translation. But as our time is limited, and 50 minutes, I'm so sorry. As our time is limited, we now maybe have to turn to a conclusion. Today's exploration of the cursive manuscripts of the Book of the Fayum has shown us a complex and dynamic picture. These manuscripts are not simply passive copies, they are active witnesses to the way scribes engaged with, studied, and worked on sacred text. We have seen a deliberate structuring of the text through layout and replication, scribal practices that hint at both professional copying and educational use, comments and variants that point to conscious philological reflection, and a remarkable diversity in material form, even when the content remained connected. Taken together, these findings remind us that the tradition of the Book of Fayum was not static. Instead, it was shaped by active reading, interpretation, and transmission processes that also left their mark materially on the manuscripts themselves. They offer us a rare glimpse into how Egyptian scribes in the Roman period learned, copied, and understood their sacred knowledge. Hopefully, further studies will reveal more of these characteristics. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully some of the people are still there.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. That was a wonderful talk, and I'm sure people will have lots of questions and comments for you.
More
I mean,
comments.
I know nothing at all uh, about Egyptian literacy or the Egyptian language, but it fascinates me. For example, the evidence for collation of manuscripts is something that fascinates me because in the tradition of in the Greek philological tradition, obviously we have very little evidence actually on the papyri from what I can see for this. We have a wide variety, for example, of papyri of Homer, which can have quite radically different texts in the early period. But what's the evidence for collation seems to come almost entirely from the scholastic tradition, and from what they tell us about scholars of Alexandria, and they never tell us very much about concrete manuscripts. Um, so I was wondering, if you to come back to the distinction that you took from Van Leeuwen about was it the hieratic manuscripts having a the role of, as it were, conserving a sacred text, and then the hieratic-demotic manuscripts being the texts that uh that, as it were to assist the study of the text. And the evidence that you provided of this scribe Nun and his copying from different manuscripts. I was wondering, I mean, does what you found confirm that view, broadly speaking, about the functions of the two types of manuscripts?
Yeah, I definitely think so, because like I presented, we have this keyjet forms that show us that we have different variants of the text, and sometimes also, oh, I have to get back. Something you can see here, for example, if we have a look at this, this is the hieroglyphic-illustrated version, and you can see here Resnet and Mehnet is mentioned. But in the hieratic version, however, the scribe thought, no, I think just Resnet should be mentioned here. And what's said about that, I need a variant for this. I need to use keyjet for this. And if you also have a look at the hieratic-demotic papyrus, not only did they mention sometimes facts like another papyrus has said it about it, but sometimes we even can find book titles. But book titles are kind of hard to detect in Egyptian, but a book title mentioned here in this text can already also be seen in the Newt book that Alexander von Leeuwen edited in 2007, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I will go ahead with one, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
You mentioned that some of these, the idea that the papyri were used in scribal training, and I was wondering if you mentioned that there are so many copies that is there evidence for this in the quality of the fragments. So what, because you showed some papyri that were really nice looking. I didn't really see any really ugly ones with many corrections and mistakes. So what is the ratio between the quality of the papyri, the good and bad ones? if so, yeah, to put it not very nicely.
Yeah, as I showed thank you for the question. As I showed in the beginning with the hieratic copies, we have like 5 of these really high quality copies, no? Which you can see, this is papyrus body A, and even though it is a high quality copy, we even can see here several corrections. Oh, it's not the right picture for this. But sometimes he really does use corrections like this one, or sometimes he also overwrites some parts. But I think these are the really high quality copies we have. These are 5 different at the Tebtunis Temple Library. And these were mostly, I think, used for like studying the text properly. But I think other copies that are more likely, like this one, or the copy of the Book of the Temple or the Book of the Fayum, shows clearly that also scribal training was important, and that these religious compositions were also important for scribal training. So getting to know these compositions and writing them down and try to write them down. And for this, they used, like we use papyrus copies, where we find Greek texts on the verso, or we find demotic, different demotic texts on the recto as well. Yes, I think this is the most interesting difference in all these copies.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Yes, Bob Bianchi.
Yeah, I want to thank you for the really, really provocative presentation. I have one comment or 2 comments to make. Maybe we can address. You suggested at the beginning of your lecture that the Book of the Fayum, however you want to define it, was stitched together from various sources in order to present more or less a kind of an overview of the area that was very actively settled during the Ptolemaic period, particularly during the reign of Arsinoe, the early Ptolemaic period. That kind of a compendium sounds to me very much like it's parallel to what Manetho was doing to try to put together for the Greeks a history of Egypt. But what I find fascinating about the Book of the Fayum so far is if that was the purpose, to collect more or less like an encyclopedic overview of the region, why do we not have evocations of it or reflections of it in Greek? In other words, if the Greeks are settling that area and want to know about it, all of the information is being conveyed in traditional pharaonic Egyptian notational systems, and we don't seem to have a crossover for the Greeks. So the question is, if the motivation is to collect information about a region, and since the region is heavily populated by a Greek population, why is the information in a language that the Greeks would not understand?
Thank you for the question. Really interesting. I also thought about that, but I think it mostly has to do with the fact that, like, the Egyptian tradition we see here, the different Egyptian traditions we see here, where the priests of the temples in the Greco-Roman period, they're responsible for these traditions and not the Greek themselves. The Ptolemies used these traditions to kind of rule Egypt, but I think these traditions are mostly like things we see only in the Egyptian temple complexes. But I think, but I think therefore it was just needed for these traditions for the Egyptian part of the Greco-Roman Egypt,
Yeah, and that more or less follows what we know about the Fayum in general, isn't it? That we basically have two parallel cultural traditions existing side by side, and there's not necessarily a visible interface between the two. So one, I think, has suggested that the Egyptian native population is conducting their own lifestyle separately from the way the Greek population is conducting their life. Two different traditions that are separate and practicing at the same time.
I think this is not always easy to answer because I showed you at the beginning a composition which that is kind of similar to the Book of the Fayum is the Book of the Temple. And from the Book of the Temple, we have like a Greek copy. So not always for every composition, it was, you could say, these are just Egyptian knowledge and we don't focus on the Egyptian knowledge. We also have like these kind of other composition that clearly interfered with the Greek tradition and the Greek language.
Well, like thank you. It was very, very instructive. I appreciate that.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah. Well, we have a yes, we have a statement from Ilaria Caridi in the chat, and I'll read it out to you. All right. If I may say, this is a temple text, a religious monograph of the religious material that the priest had to know about the Fayum, not a guidebook to the region for the lay people. It may have responded to a general impetus of making compendia that may have been influenced by the Greek milieu, but it's not a composition addressed to the public.
Yes, yeah, this is also really a really important thing to say, that we here have like really a religious monograph, like for the priestly scribal training in the temple and not for people like in the Graeco, for example.
Yeah. We have a question from Chobalada. Choba, please go ahead.
Yes, hello, thank you very much. First of all, very many congratulations on this fascinating paper. I really enjoyed it. It was very helpfully illustrated, so it was easy to follow. I'm only sorry that I joined a little late, unfortunately. I had a meeting before it. Could we possibly go back to slide 65, please?
65, yes.
And there you showed us a very interesting text, interesting for lots of different reasons. It's a Vienna papyrus.
Yes.
D10-104.
Oh, the pictures have, sorry, the pictures are so big.
Yeah,
yeah.
And you mentioned that one side was hieratic. Obviously, this is the hieratic side. The other side is demotic,
yes,
if I remember correctly.
Yes, yes.
And you also mentioned, and I think we can see it quite faintly on this slide, that this is in actual fact a palimpsest.
Mm-hmm.
And the lower text is a Greek documentary text. So the Greek text, some list probably, if I remember correctly, you said it was some list or something like that, was rubbed at, washed at, and recycled to write a hieratic religious text. So this is really an unusual situation, isn't it? A Greek documentary text recycled for inscribing an Egyptian religious text in the hieratic script. There are not many such examples around. Have you seen any similar examples?
Oh, I think there clearly are. There are many examples in the Greco-Roman period, because I think what you were thinking about, that we know from the earlier periods of the Egyptian history, that for religious text, fresh papyrus should be used. But in the Roman period, as also I think Kim Riehold put together really nicely, we can see that many different Greek documentary texts were used to have like these religious compositions on them. For example, I also showed, I have to back the picture. I also showed you this fragment of the hieratic-demotic copy.
Yes.
And this hieratic-demotic copy has also a Greek documentary text on the recto. So we can see that papyrus was reused. Some scholars link that to the reduced material that some of these temples had in the 2nd century CE. But we do not know clearly. We just know that reusing papyrus, also papyrus for religious composition, was, you could say, a thing. But like I wanted to show you in my talk, maybe these compositions like this one or other multi-palimpsests like the other one were used for scribal training, where it was maybe not so important to have like fresh papyrus.
Yes, I agree with you. I know other examples too, but it's not very common. Could we go back to slide 74, please?
Yeah.
So this is a Berlin text. What's the inventory number on this, please?
The inventory number of this Berlin text. Oh, I can tell you right away.
Well, it doesn't matter. You can send it to me by email.
Yeah, I will. I definitely will. Yeah.
And which is which side? Huh? So on the left we see the hieratic copy. Oh no, it's a demotic copy.
It's a hieratic-demotic, so it
it's
kind of switches between these two languages. So
on the left we have the recto, and on the right we have the verso. Is that right?
Yes.
And the verso on the right is a palimpsest.
Yeah, so this papyrus was used on the recto already for a Greek documentary text.
The recto is the palimpsest. Okay. I'm looking for similar examples. I'm working on a text which has exactly this problem. And I couldn't find many similar examples, so it's very helpful to have these additional examples.
I will definitely send you the number.
That would be very kind. Thank you very much.
I think we have another remark from Yara Karidi in the chat on these.
Sorry, I didn't want to, hijack the conversation, but as Jaqueline was saying, is very not unusual at all for our papyri. Some 40% of the demotic papyri in the Temple Library deposit in Florence, but in Copenhagen is quite the same, and some 12% of the hieratic papyri are on reused papyrus. And we are not talking about writing exercises, but actual books from the library. And we'll have a conference about that next week.
I know.
If I may do some publicity,
I'm really looking forward to this. So
thank you, Jaqueline. We are looking forward to have you also in Florence next. But I'll just leave the link here, and I'll be quiet. Sorry.
No.
Thank you for the fantastic presentation, Jaqueline. We're looking forward to having you in Florence soon.
Yeah, thank you for your input. I mean, you are the expert on this field. You have like the great overview of the Tebtunis Temple Library, where I am stitching together my text copy. So really
congratulations for all the work that you've done and for this great presentation.
And could I possibly ask Ilaria here?
Yes, of course.
You mentioned that in Florence, the Florence collection of Tebtunis papyri from the library of Tebtunis. A significant proportion is sort of reused papyrus, reused texts, palimpsests, in other words. And
not palimpsest, but reused on the other side.
yeah,
We have no palimpsest because probably they're all
exactly.
very long text, which was, you know, a hassle to wash and reuse, but they are reused on the verso.
Right. Thank you for this clarification.
Sorry, yeah,
this is very helpful. What I'm actually talking about, and what I was very excited about when I heard Jaqueline's presentation, slide 65 and then slide 74, that she has found examples of palimpsests, which have been recycled, the lower text scratched out or washed out and then written over for a second time.
Okay, yeah.
And what tends to surprise people, because perhaps they think in quite sort of traditional or cliched ways, is that the lower text is Greek, and they can't understand that Greek texts were reused to write Egyptian. Greek papyri were used to write Egyptian texts. They think it was the other way around.
Yeah.
In historical terms, the Greeks supplanting
right.
Egyptians.
But these were, they were like administrative role taxes that were no longer useful, and so they were ready to be reused.
Exactly. But for my particular research, what is especially interesting is that Greek texts were scratched out so that the papyrus could be reused for writing Egyptian texts, Egyptian religious texts, which is really kind of a retrograde step, historically speaking.
And it's exactly what we're working on, not palimpsest, because we don't have like none of them in our collection, but reused is like, 50% on the
other side. The other side was reused.
And it's really knowing where these texts were from, where did they acquire them, if they put them together, the longer rolls inside the temple or not. These are all very fascinating questions that we're working on at the moment at the Istituto Papyrologico in Florence.
But if I understood you correctly, you don't have there any palimpsests.
No, they're really rare, as I think there's one in Copenhagen, I'm quite sure, but almost anything in Florence, but I'll have to look it up. I don't know if Jaqueline has better data on palimpsests.
So I would argue also only for this example from Vienna. And like I said, the other copy that I mentioned was this hieratic copy with the Book of the Temple and the Book of the Fayum. This is also not really a palimpsest because you can see like they just stopped writing and then had enough space left for the Book of the Fayum.
Yeah, it's like a writing exercise or something.
It
looks like that. But there's a Greek on the recto, if I understood that the example you're talking about correctly.
Thank you very much to you both.
Thank you, and we hope to see you at our conference next week.
Definitely.
It would be great to have you.
I look forward to it.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ilaria. Thanks, Trevor. I was curious if you could maybe. So we have with the Egyptian temple scribes. We seem to have something rather like a monastic scriptorium or something, where there's a canon of texts that are being reproduced and copied, and people are learning to copy these particular texts because they're important in a particular locality or for a particular rite or temple culture, I suppose. Is that right? I mean, I was fascinated by I've never, I was fascinated by the fact that the scribe was leaving words open for the rubricator to fill in fill in later. Is that right? Are we dealing with different hands in this case?
I don't think so that we are dealing
Okay.
with different hands. We have, I think, many different examples of this. For example, there's papyrus that many, also mostly Demetrius will know, is the papyrus London Leiden, where we can see this really more clearly. There are really huge gaps between the different signs and the rubricated phrases. I think it's mostly the same hand. I think you could think about it, it's much more handy because if you want to add the rubricated passages, you have to use another ink for that.
Yeah.
And you have maybe use also another pen for that.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's much more easier to just write the black text first and then just add these rubricated passages that were most likely numbers and each and the same phrase. You saw that, I think. If I go back, the pictures. Maybe if we go back to this patches, you can clearly see that's it's mostly just for one column. It's just set 10, set 10, set 10. So it's kind of easy to like leave space for that, and afterwards just adding the red ink phrases. And about like these processes of what was the place for copying, why did they copy this, and so it's not so easy to answer. Some scholars tend to say it has to do something with the House of Life, like it's an institution that was mentioned also in the Pharaonic period for the creation of text like this, but it's not really easy to answer this for the Greco-Roman periods. Like we still are learning about all these transmission processes, and which is why work from Ilaria Caridi is really important to us, because we now can see a large quantity of like these papyri analyzed. Does it answer your question? Or
Thank you. Do we have any more questions or comments? Well, I mean, I
hello.
I don't know. It's I was wondering. I mean, the fact that you have this this practice of picking out certain recurring phrases in red implies, I suppose, a degree of need or desire to locate particular passages quickly, right?
Yes.
Within the text, which we don't, for example, see in Greek literary papyri, to the same extent, I think.
Yeah, maybe it's also kind of interesting that this is like a religious, and you can also say for the Egyptians as well as a scientific papyrus. So we have this large companion of different knowledge areas, and therefore it totally makes sense that we have like these phrases, these different places rubricated here, and also it makes sense that we have in the crocodile litany. What? It also does make sense that we have in the crocodile litany maybe the different numbers of like the offerings. So these are really maybe information that they needed. But I think I'm not an expert in narrative literature, but in narrative literature we also have like certain phrases replicated, which interfere with the beginnings of sections.
Yeah.
At least in Egyptian papyri.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, yes.
But if you are interested in this, you should really look up the work of Sarah Brown, who is focusing on these passages, also in literary papyri.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments on this wonderful paper? Well, in that case, I suppose we will thank Jaqueline for this amazing lecture. and we will see you next month, the same time for our next talk, which will take us back in a more Hellenic direction, I guess. But yes, thank you very much. Thank you, and thanks to everyone who attended.
Thank you really much for the invitation.